Hello everyone, I hope everyone is doing well. So today we're going to be talking about the process of science. Specifically, we're going to be talking about what is a scientist? What does a scientist do? What is the process that scientists use in order to answer questions? What is the scientific method? Science has never been more relevant than today. We are dealing with a global pandemic, and there are scientists who are working around the clock in an effort to find a vaccine, in an effort to find a treatment for the coronavirus. So if this sounds exciting for you, let's go ahead and get started. So the first question that I have is, what is science? Science is a method to answer questions. It's a way of knowing. Scientists use data in order to back up their claims. And it's because facts matter. In today's society, facts matter. So I am a biologist, but what do biologists do? So biologists, they study living organisms. So biology is the study of life, is the study of living organisms. So for example, there are some biologists who are studying bacteria. So those small unicell organisms that make you sick. So those are considered to be alive. Plants are considered to be alive. Plants are doing photosynthesis and cellular respiration. And we'll talk about that later during the semester. We, as humans, we are alive. Other mammals, such as dogs, are alive. In science, we have a specific criteria, a specific set of rules in order to determine whether something is alive or not. And for example, there are certain organisms, such as viruses, that they don't meet this criteria. And we'll talk about that later on. So biologists study questions. They can focus on one specific cell and they can say, what's the function of this cell? So in this case, I'm looking at a neuron. So those are very specialized cells that are found in your brain. Those are the cells that allow you to think. Those are the cells that allow you to dream, that allow you to remember things. Or they can focus on a group of these cells and how do they interact with one another. So in this case, I'm looking at the brain. So the brain is the most powerful machine that you have in your body. It is the most powerful machine in the world. The brain allows you to think, allows you to remember things. And basically, in my own biased opinion, because I studied the brain, it allows you to determine who you are as a human being. Other questions can be as, where do we come from? Are we aliens? Did we came from outer space? Or they can focus on the different changes that are happening in your brain. So when you were born, when you were a baby, the brain is massive in comparison to your body. And this is why when a baby is born, it is unable to walk. It is unable to do much, and it's because the brain is massive in comparison to the brain. But as the neurons begin to talk to one another or begin to form connections, then you see that all of a sudden you begin to walk. And as the brain continues to develop, you see that you're able to do more complex functions, such as, for example, you acquire a language, or you're able to have more coordinated movement. And then as we get older, something happens to our brain. We begin to lose those neurons. Those cells in our brain begin to die off. And we begin to have problems. So for example, Alzheimer's disease is a disease that is caused by the neurons of our brain that are dying. And when those cells die off, we begin to lose memories. And in my own biased opinion, once you lose those memories, you also lose yourself. Other questions can be as, you know, how are we evolving? How are we changing? Do we have a common ancestor with the primates? Do we have a common ancestor with all the other organisms that are living in our planet? So nowadays, almost everyone has access to the internet. And essentially, you have access to tremendous amount of information. And a lot of times what happens is that this information is conflicting. And the question is, which one should you believe? Which one's true? So the purpose of this class is to teach you to analyze data, to analyze graphs, in an effort to teach you to determine what information is true. What information should you believe? And the reason for that is because a lot of times what happens is that we get news reports. So in this particular case, we're talking about caffeine. Caffeine causes cancer. Caffeine can prevent some diseases. Caffeine can be poisonous. How is it possible that caffeine can be helpful to your body and can also be harmful at the same time? Which one's true? Which one should you believe? So we're going to teach you how to read graphs in order to determine which of this information is true. But the most important thing that I can tell you is to always ask to show me the data. Show me the data and let me make my own conclusions. Don't let anybody decide for you. Scientists use data in order to back up their claims. But as I told you before, one of the most important things that we as consumers, that we as humans, what we can do is to ask for the data and look at the data ourselves and make our own conclusions. Don't let anybody decide for you. Make sure you look at the data and based on that, determine whether what they're telling you is true or not. Now, one of the beautiful things about science is that science is evolving. We are always coming up with new technologies, with more powerful microscopes, so that we can take a look at the same question. And perhaps what was true 10 years ago, it might not be true today. And that's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing that science is evolving. Now let's talk a little bit about the scientific method. So the scientific method is the process that scientists use in order to answer a question. And a scientific method begins by making an observation. Something caught your attention. And based on that, you came out with a broad question. And you are curious. So scientists are curious people. So they began to read papers in order to determine what is already known about that specific thing that caught your attention, And then based on that, then you can design your question. And in this case, we use what we call hypothesis. And we'll talk about hypothesis later on. After you design your hypothesis, then you have to design an experiment. And you have to design this experiment very carefully. After you design your experiment, then you collect data. You collect and analyze the data. And based on that, then you can determine your conclusions. Again, the scientific method begins with making an observation. And based on that observation, then we can come up with a broad question. And then we begin to read papers. We begin to read, do a little bit of research to determine what has already been done on that specific broad question. And then we design a hypothesis. So we basically make a more specific question. And then based on that, we design an experiment to test our hypotheses. And then we begin to collect data and to analyze the data. And lastly, we'd come out with a conclusion. Perhaps you have noticed that after you drink some coffee, you have more energy. And so based on making that observation, then maybe you came out with this question. Does coffee boost energy? So let's see how are we able to test this hypothesis. So the first thing that we need to do is to do a little bit of research to determine what has already been done about coffee and energy. So specifically, scientists, what they do, they read peer-reviewed journals.